Today, I am going to start a new book. The book is called Interconnected. It is this one by Gyalwang Karmapa. And the subtitle is Embracing Life in Our Global Society. I'm going to spend a little time on the introduction. I usually don't spend too much time on the introduction, but I thought it was well worth going into. And this introduction is done by two women that worked with Gyalwang Karmapa on these talks. And it's Karen Darris and Damcho Diane Finnegan. And these talks were given to American college students from Redlands University in California, in India, by Gyalwang Karmapa. But the introduction goes into this a little bit more. So to start out with, they say that the Karmapa talks about needing to quit looking at happiness like it's a zero-sum game. Gain my happiness at the cost of someone else losing their happiness. We need to start looking at living and life with other people as a mutual flourishing, being realistic and possible. We need to have an open mind and a sincere willingness to act within what is possible. This is not talking about, dreaming and, oh, wouldn't it be wonderful if, that this is actually possible. Here is a quote from the introduction. From the world of siloed societies and independent individuals, many people have begun to recognize that we are interconnected communities and interdependent individuals. So this is the switch that they're talking about. Siloed societies is a term referring to very isolated societies or communities where they're focused on themselves, their own well-being, and then the rest of the world they're not so concerned about, if they're concerned at all. And so we have to go from that viewpoint, and separate individuals also as part of that viewpoint, to seeing that these communities are interconnected and that individuals are interdependent, that we rely on each other. In this book, which is a series of teachings that Gyalwang Karmapa gave to these college students, he explores global issues through this, they use the word lens of interdependence. Gyalwang Karmapa wants us to lead changes, to be the ones that help have our collective behavior change. The change needs to be that our global society works together in consort, as opposed to being resistant to these realities of interdependence. And he backs up much of what he says with some Western science-based findings. Many modern academic studies have shown that our world functions in many diverse ways, but interdependently. This will be a reoccurring theme in this book. He doesn't talk a lot about Buddhism and Buddhist positions and the Buddhist theory of interdependence. This is more talking about what can be seen and experienced and what modern society has shown. Here's another quote here: exploring the possibilities for social and ethical transformation that interdependence opens up. The book is based on the premise that a heightened awareness of these interconnections and interdependence can bring behavioral changes that actually work with these realities of interdependence rather than against it or fighting it. So they'll be in these various chapters exploring possibilities for transformation, ethical transformation, social transformation, and so forth. The book is based on our shared human condition and our shared concerns for the world, rather than being concerned for what is in it for ourselves. And he talks about not only outer interdependence, but also inner interdependence, about how everybody has an emotional life and interpretations of experience and individual responses to what we experience externally. He talks about the outer world, which would be the natural world, the social and economic world that we live in, and then the inner world, which is our human attitudes and actions, our perceptions, our ideas, our interpretations, our emotions, and how these interact and shape how we respond and how we interpret and how we contribute to these connections. Here is another quote from this introduction. Emotions serve as a force that is essential for translating intellectual understanding into positive action, end quote. So we need to feel this connection. We need to take intellectual understanding into our experience, and you could say take it to heart. They point out that this is rather interesting because usually Buddhism talks about negative emotions, and here Karmapa will be talking more about positive emotions. And positive emotions are empathy, courage, contentment, patience, responsibility, mental agility, being able to, you might say, change the way you see things, the way you interpret things, to come up with new solutions, these things differently, and so forth. But mental agility, I would say that would be the opposite of being rigid and bound by habitual patterns. And then imagination is also a positive emotion. So we can feel connected through these emotions. And empathy then transforms into compassionate action. Responsibility is seen as an opportunity. underlying the whole book is the premise that we have Buddha nature. So that does come from the teachings of the Buddha and Buddhism. And the idea of Buddha nature is that the absolute nature of our mind is perfection, beyond good and bad. It is from our Buddha nature that compassion, loving kindness, patience, and all these other good qualities that I have just mentioned come from, that we don't have to get these from outside of ourselves. As a result, the solution to the problems of the world are within us. We don't have to get them from somewhere else. There are 3 sections of this book. So the first one is the interdependent nature of who we are and the world that we live in. The next is the innate emotional qualities and ethical virtues that we need to cultivate that enhance point number 1, the interdependent nature of the world and ourselves. These inner qualities and social values that shape us. And they are experiencing our connection to others, empathy, contentment, freedom. Another one is to mobilize our ethical actions. And this involves responsibility, courage, and compassion. Here in the introduction, they talk about intellectual understanding as seeing the connection. And this then transforms into awareness, which is feeling the connection. And then that goes into effective action, which is living the connection. This is the process. So then this is, you might say, the second book of a series of teachings that Gyalwang Karmapa gave to American college students from Redlands University. The first series was made into the book, The Heart is Noble. So this came out later. These talks were given in the, I think around 2012, 2013. He then, going on with this, that he asks, what are the conditions for happiness? How can we create them individually and collectively? What are the conditions that cause suffering, and how can we end them? He talks about a number of issues here in this area. First, conditions that cause human and animals or environmental harm. So there's consumerism culture. And this leaves us vulnerable to manipulation. And then the use of technology. He feels we need to use it more wisely and be more mindful. That we need to avoid online behavior that leaves us feeling disconnected, and avoid harmful ways of relating to each other online. What came to mind when I read that was there's a new phrase. It isn't that new, but it's a little newer to me because I'm not online that often or compared to younger people, but it is fear of being left out. And that can be a huge problem for people. They see all these posts on the various social media of people smiling, looking very good and having a good time. And meanwhile, they're home looking at this and, what about me? Anyway, This interconnected means that the self and others are not separate, that we are in almost an infinite number of relationships with others, with communities, with the environment, and that we need to re-examine all of this and really see it more clearly. We need to reorient our inner and outer landscape, our emotional and our social landscape. And we need to live interdependently with each other and living for each other. Here's another quote. Karmapa's mode of engaging with us, meaning the students and the adults that were there in the room, provided the example of what he was describing, allowing others to form part of one's own self while committing to forming a condition for others' flourishing. Very simply, in this introduction, they said there are choices being made all the times. We can simply put up walls or we can build bridges. Walls means resistance to change in behavior, in lifestyle, fear of others that are not like us. And bridges are new possibilities, new ways of seeing things, working with interdependence. They suggest that we use our own experience when reading the book and examining our point of view and how we view others. Examine the world, take a fresh look, they suggest. And that all of this is really starting the conversation and getting going this process where the readers of the book become active participants through questioning, looking at assumptions, examining and re-examining experiences, and so forth. And I would say that it would be good maybe to have more questions and discussion after I give my talk each time. So I'm going to encourage that too. They use the metaphor of a lens, that we need to have a wider lens to zoom out and include more in our experience and our way of thinking and acting and being. I have heard this put in other ways. A traditional Tibetan way would be, we need to look from the top of the mountain rather than looking from a narrow valley. Another term would be an aerial view, so that you see more of what's going on and you have some distance between what is happening and your reaction to it. So that completes the introduction. Now, the first section is called Seeing the Connection. And the first part of this is our interdependent world. And I'm going to go into this tonight. I won't get finished with this first chapter, but I will get well into it. To begin with, we are in very close contact with the whole world. Some of you have heard me use this example before, but I think it's very appropriate here. And that is, I like to snack on roasted nuts. And I was looking at it was, I think, about a 2-pound jar of roasted nuts. And I was looking at the label on it. And the company that owned this subsidiary is Hormel, which makes Spam. That's their most famous product. And they're in Austin, Minnesota, not Austin, Texas, a relatively small city in Minnesota. And it gave the country of origin. And it was tropical countries, Vietnam, Indonesia, Brazil, and a number of other tropical countries. And also, one of the nuts could possibly come from the United States. So in this jar of nuts, there were people in very remote, diverse parts of the world that went into producing the nuts, growing them and harvesting them, preparing them for shipping and so forth. And then there were the people that produced the machinery necessary to plant, grow, cultivate, harvest, crack the nuts, process them, and on and on and on. And then there was the energy, whether it be electric or a diesel or whatever, that had to come from somewhere else, and on and on and on, that we're in a global economy. And just by buying a jar of roasted nuts, I touched people in Minnesota, people all over the world. And that is the way the world works, that we are constantly benefiting from the work that other people that we have never heard of, never seen, never will see, but we're benefiting from them. And all these people that had something to do with those nuts, they needed food, clothing, and shelter. They had a family, most likely. And it just goes and spreads and spreads and spreads. So we have these interconnections, we have this interdependence. And if we start taking a closer look, we find that we benefit so much from the work that other people have done. As I said in the introduction, interdependence is very important in Buddhism. But here, Karmapa is taking a more secular approach. He uses interdependence to explain microsystems and macrosystems. How does that sound for not being Buddhist? This is more in terms of business, economics, and so on and so forth. Interdependence is used by scientists and professionals in many different fields. Environmental science, for instance, psychology, sociology, economics, and so forth. All of this is not new to the Western way of thinking things or business models and so forth. So if we can deepen our awareness of these interconnections, this leads to a more harmonious and healthy society, and we have more satisfying lives. And of course, it spills over to other people that we are interconnected with. This involves the human heart, the human mind, our inner world, and he uses the term a web or webs of interdependence. Inside each of us, there's a complex collection of perceptions, ideas, feelings, intentions, and they mutually affect one another. If we really pay attention, we can see the same thing many different ways, positive or negative. At one time, we might feel, I really like these roasted nuts. And then At another time, you might say, or I might say, but then there is this plastic jar that is empty when the nuts are gone, and what do I do with it, and why did they produce it in the first place, and it's polluting the planet, and yada, yada, yada. And then there'd be more than that, ways to look at things. That our minds are very creative. I think that's a good word for it. The transformation begins with us, not someone else, that we transform our inner world first. He mentions 3 stages of this transformation. The first is to gain intellectual awareness of interdependence. And then from that intellectual understanding, we gain emotional awareness of interdependence. And this helps bring out our inner qualities that are important, the inner qualities that will sustain our emotional engagement. We need to feel interdependent. And then the third is to reorient our relationships to others and our way of being in the world. Quote, when our understanding of interdependence has moved from head to heart and into action, our lives become fully effective and meaningful. And I'm going to stress effective and meaningful. Later on in the book, they'll look at social and environmental justice and what that means. And these become possible only when there is significant change in our attitudes and the intentional behavior that these attitudes give rise to. That was just in the first few pages of this chapter. Now, the next, this is just different sections of this first chapter. Why and how interdependence matters. Well, interdependence means impermanence. And I like the example of ice covering a lake in the wintertime in terms of change and impermanence. We live up here in northern Wisconsin. The lakes will, even small lakes, will form a thick covering of ice in the wintertime. And then the snow is on top of that, and the land is covered with snow too. And then when the weather warms up, the snow melts, but the lake still has ice on it. And it looks like nothing is happening. But what's actually happening is the ice is melting from underneath where it's in contact with the water, and the sun is shining on it, and the ice is warming up from the sun and the warm air. And then one day you look out on the lake and the ice is gone. And change can be that way, that it might seem we're getting nowhere. On the other hand, suddenly something happens and conditions are very different. It doesn't always work that way. Sometimes you just have to plug away at it over and over and over and over and over. But anyway, interdependence means change, that things are not permanent, and that we have freedom within this interdependence to change, to work towards our goals, and gathering the conditions and causes that we need to accomplish these goals that we are trying to accomplish. Very simply, quote, interdependence means if we change, so do others. I have found this. I like to use the analogy of let's say, a ping pong game. We get in habitual patterns with others, and it's like a ping pong game. Maybe you serve, maybe the other person serves, but you respond in a very habitual pattern that's very much like hitting the ball back. And then they hit the ball back, and then you hit it, and you go back and forth. And maybe you're in an argument, and you're going to see who wins. Well, the whole game ends as soon as somebody doesn't hit the ball back. And you can choose to not hit the ball back. You can change and I don't need to play this game anymore. It can be very perplexing to the other person. Again, a person that is an alcoholic, when they go through treatment and stop drinking, when they're back with their other alcoholic friends, they will go out of their way to encourage that person to keep on drinking, because it's contrary to what you might say the game was, the habitual patterns were. This gives us tremendous power when we start realizing that if we change, others do. Things aren't solid, that there's cause and effect. There is this web of causality. There's room for change to happen. There's actually a lot of room, a lot of space for change to happen if we can keep aware of this space. And the world can change. The world has changed. So interdependence has practical consequences in every aspect of our life and the life of the planet: environmental, economic, social, ethical, and so forth. That all of these are influenced by interdependence. He goes on and says that we need to bring clarity and understanding to social systems, to our emotional life, to the material world. And specifically, he talks about the health of the planet. It's pretty obvious to most of us that the planet is not in a healthy situation right now, that there are species that are becoming extinct. We're having more severe weather, global warming, and so forth. But here is a quote of Karmapa's: well-being of our global society as well as our individual happiness both depend on our learning how to live fully in tune with our interdependence. And then he says, and he has a list of questions here. We're going to go into these in the book. He says, quote, we must ask some basic questions. How would the way we relate to others change if we began to feel our interconnectedness? What human values come to the fore when we acknowledge our interdependence emotionally as well as intellectually? What would a global society that fully embraced interdependence look like? What can we ourselves do to help create that society? That's how he ends that section, which is, let's go back to that. Why and how interdependence matters. So then the next is, what is truly yours? Here he examines the nature of self using this lens of interdependence. And he is challenging how we see ourselves in relationship to others emotionally and in our actions. So, first of all, there's this investigation of self. No separate individual is fully self-sustaining or separate from others. You cannot go off and separate yourself completely from others. He continues questioning. He says, is the self your body? Well, we come from our biological parents, their cells. We were dependent on them for food, water, and of course, we were inside our mother and totally dependent on her. And once you're born, then, as I said, you're dependent on them for food and water, clothing, housing, medical care if you need it and can get it. A lot of people don't have medical care, or at least much. Parental care. So that's about our body. Then what about our mind? Well, he asks the question, are all of your thoughts entirely original? Or do they come from somewhere else outside of you? Is your language an original language, or did you learn a language that others spoke? How about the culture that you absorbed and are familiar with? The governmental system, even the family system that you grew up in, technology, all of this came from outside of us, and it too is interdependent and it evolves. Technology is evolving incredibly fast. At least that's my viewpoint. I can't keep up with it. So happiness and suffering depend on others. We will see the suffering of others, but usually we don't realize that we can't be happy without others. It's very difficult to be happy going off all by yourself and never seeing anyone else. And even if you would try to do that, you again cannot separate yourself from other people. Even if you're out there hunting and trapping and living off of nature, well, the technology that you're using was developed by other people. Unless you're making your own traps, making your own rope, and you did not learn these skills from anyone else. And then you're dependent on nature and animals, so you're dependent on them. To quote Gyalwang Karmapa, therefore, it is not entirely correct to call it me, but neither is it someone other than you. To go on, with this understanding that we feel a sense of profound connection to others, whether they be human or animals, we can experience the contributions of others with gratitude and goodwill. Now he comes back to our mind or our consciousness. And he says 99% of what goes on in our mind is not original. I find that kind of an interesting statement. I'd never thought about it quite like that before. So are all of your thoughts entirely original? Is your culture original? What you think of and hold on to as yourself, is that original, or is it really more a product of others? Very simply, the answer is that many causes and conditions contributed to the creation of who you are. He says that this intellectual understanding is a beginning. It's only a beginning, that we need to understand this at a very deep level. I have heard the phrase, take it into your experience. And I think that's a good phrase to use here. The aspiration is to feel the extent to which others are extremely important to us, our way of life, our existence, and so forth. And then secondly, to develop an emotional awareness that you are never, ever really separate from them. And this, of course, leads to seeing that your happiness and suffering partly depends on others, and theirs depends on you. And when that happens, he has a list of 3 things here that will result from that. First of all, we will feel a sense of profound connection to other beings. Secondly, we will experience their contributions to who we are with gratitude and goodwill. The third is we will see and feel that we simply must consider others' well-being. Now, the next section is wonder of breathing. And he talks about how this interconnection is when it comes to breathing and oxygen. We cannot live without oxygen. It's that simple, that our bodies need oxygen and we need it regularly. And oxygen is provided by a very complex network of plants, water, sunshine, and other conditions. We exhale carbon dioxide as a waste product. Plants breathe it in. They take the carbon and give back oxygen as a waste product. And so we benefit from this relationship. Without plants, there would be very little oxygen in the environment. Oxygen gets very quickly used up, among other things, rusting old automobiles and so forth. Interestingly, the indigenous people in Amazon and other parts of the world talk about the rainforest in Amazon as being the lungs of the world. These rainforests produce a tremendous amount of oxygen, and the oxygen gets transported all over the earth. Now, certainly there are other parts wherever you have plants, oxygen is produced, so it isn't just the rainforest. These rainforests are, I guess, not 24/7, but 12 months out of the year, they don't freeze like up here. And they're producing a lot of oxygen. We can see that these trees and plants and the sun are present in our every cell. Our breath is present in the cells of these plants. Scientists can tell when they find a body that maybe lived during the Roman Empire, or, they found people in the melting glaciers that are much older than the Roman Empire, and they can tell by analyzing cells what they ate and where they came from. because this is the connection that we have. So Karmapa says we can develop, by looking into this, a sense of wonder and gratitude towards the planet. We bring this knowledge from our head to our heart and develop these new feelings about the planet. This can cause, in his words, a fundamental reorientation towards others and our place in the world. And I want to add that Thich Nhat Hanh teaches on the same topic, on remembering our roots, country, the land that we came from, the culture that we came from, and so forth. I remember his very close associate, Sister Chan Kong, going through a guided meditation, and she was saying that the Vietnamese have a little banana in them. And that's the way it is. So now the next section is nourishing the world. And here the idea is the container and the contents. The world is the container, and the contents is the life that lives on the surface of the world, under the surface of the world, and above the surface of the world, in the air. So we have this very, very tight connection as humans and animals to the natural environment, that we're all contents. And the planet holds and sustains us. Without it, he said, we would literally fall apart. Contents, he says, also means nourishment, that we nourish the earth and it nourishes us. So again, going back to carbon dioxide, one of my favorite metaphors, of course, is manure. We produce human manure, animals produce manure, and it is good for the earth if it's treated properly. And then the Tibetans, they had sky burial, where after a person died and consciousness has left, they would feed the corpse to the vultures. So there is this interconnection that we have with the earth. And of course, in modern society, it's so easy to miss this. I remember a man who grew up in New York City being here in peak wild raspberry season. And I would go out there and have dessert. I wasn't picking them to bring them in. Maybe I was selfish, but I would just go out there, and when I got full, I was done with dessert. He refused to eat them because they did not come from a grocery store. This whole connection was gone with him. And it's so easy to think that food comes from grocery stores rather than from farmers and fields. We need to keep this in mind even when we are buying things in the grocery store or in the restaurant. Basically, everything that we use, everything that we value, except for sunlight, comes from the earth. At the present time now, it may have come from somewhere else at an earlier point in time, but right now it's coming from the earth. So we have to be careful that we don't stain the container and harm the container in other ways. And then the next section is all relationships go both ways. But really, before I get into that, I want to talk about, there is a book. I've never read it. I don't even know how I heard about it, but I heard about it. And the book is Living with Stars, How the Human Body is Connected to Life Cycles of the Earth, the Planets, and the Stars. A husband and wife team wrote this. An astrophysicist who was a senior fellow at the Lockheed Martin Solar and Astrophysics Laboratory. How about that for a title? I'm going to say his name is pronounced Carl Shriver, but there's a J in there, a JV. And then his wife, Iris, who is a professor of pathology at Stanford University. So they were being interviewed, and the interviewer said, "We are stardust." Joni Mitchell famously sang in Woodstock. It turns out she was right, wasn't she? Iris answered, "Was she ever? Everything we are and everything in the universe and on Earth originated from stardust, and it continually floats through us even today. It directly connects us to the universe, rebuilding our bodies over and over again over our lifetime." With that note, I'm going to go into this next section here. All relationships go both ways. So we can benefit the world or we can harm it. And now the earth is being harmed. But on the other hand, if we start understanding this, that our individual acts have far-reaching consequences because of causality and because of interdependence and impermanence. Everybody in a relationship is changed if one person changes. He makes this interesting observation. Parents make children, children make parents. He says, quote, "We need to cultivate different lenses so we can gain awareness of our interdependence on both vast and intimate scales." That was another reason why I talked about we are stardust. I see there's another quote to this author here, so I'm going to read that. "That was one of the biggest surprises for us in this book. We really didn't realize how impermanent we are and that our bodies are made of remnants of stars and massive explosions in galaxies. All of the material in our bodies originates with the residual stardust, and it finds its way into plants and from there into nutrients that we need for everything that we do, think, move, grow. And every few years, the bulk of our bodies are newly created." And to go on, here is a little bit about the contents of the book. "We rebuild using elements captured from our surroundings and are thereby connected to animals and plants around us and to the bacteria within us that help digest them, and to the geological processes such as continental drift and volcanism here on Earth. We also are intimately linked to the sun's nuclear furnace and to the solar winds and to collisions with asteroids and to the cycles of birth of stars and their deaths in cataclysmic supernova." I'm going to quit reading. Sounds like an interesting book. Maybe we should have that one next.